Thank you so very much, Program Director. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends, comrades, and those who used to be comrades. I'm happy to be with you today at this summer school. I will be speaking from the perspective of a Black liberation theologian, so hence the title and subtitle of my talks, which will become clear as we go along. Among the many lessons I have learned from the years of my participation in our struggle for freedom, and have come to believe increasingly over the last 30 years of South Africa's democratic experiment, as a pastor, a preacher, a theologian, and an activist, it is this: there are no shortcuts to liberation and justice. There are no substitutes for the struggle for freedom, for dignity, for equity, self-respect, just as there is no substitute for sacrifice. A true revolution needs no subtitles. The struggle, said Albert Luthuli, would be for freedom, justice, and human dignity, and there could be no substitute. We are bent on liberation. Biko wrote way back in the 70s, we have set out on a quest for true humanity, and somewhere on the distant horizon we can see the glimmering prize. So let us march forth with courage and determination, drawing from our common plight, and in time we shall be in a position to bestow upon the world the greatest gift possible, a more human face. That is how I understand, firstly, your fascinating theme for this gathering and your entirely justified emphasis on Matu Fatso, the continuing humanization of one another and societies through open, truthful, and critical dialogue and through purposeful action, I would add. And on Impilo, life living well with one another, a life lived in health towards healing and wholeness. This is, from a Christian point of view, the life Jesus has promised, a life abundant here on earth just as God intended. That is also the reason why Christians are called to participate in struggles for justice and revolutions for change. It is not only about a different kind of society or a different world, it is about a new humanity. All this, however, requires a fundamentally changed heart, a decolonized mind, a revolutionized spirit, and a radicalized consciousness. Without these, Matu Fatso and Impilo have no chance at all. Consequently, I have come to speak of black consciousness as a fourfold or perhaps fivefold consciousness: a critical, self-critical consciousness, a liberating consciousness, an empowering consciousness, an engaging consciousness, and a humanizing consciousness. Altogether, these make of that consciousness a revolutionary consciousness. One can also call it a life-giving consciousness in part of our theme. Now, John Calvin, from whom this quote comes, is the father of the Reformed tradition, at least the Reformed tradition that I adhere to, not the Reformed tradition that the White Dutch Reformed churches adhere to. The faith tradition, in my understanding, that makes this very clear. Biko's human face and your theme equal Calvin's concept of full humanity. Calvin writes in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 9, full humanity requires liberty. Calvin understood that full humanity, that is, meaningful life as free children of God, endowed with inalienable rights to meaningful life, to worthiness, justice, equity, dignity, and of having choices, cannot be realized while people remain in the chains of social hesitation, economic deprivation, and political ambiguity. It requires freedom. He talks about full humanity, not 3/5 of a person, as the Constitution of the United States to this day describes Americans of African descent with, quote, no rights a white man is bound to respect, end quote. That's the decision 1857 of the Dred Scott decision in the U.S. Supreme Court as they declared it then. The consequences of that mindset are palpable in the mindless havoc and racism and white supremacist nationalism are causing in that country even as we speak. Full humanity, not once born, broken or split or burned, as the outcasts, the Dalits, are called in India. Not creatures, English for skepsels, that white South Africans used to call us and describe us in their literature and in their dictionaries to ensure that on the farms and on the streets, in school and in church, in formal speeches and casual conversations, this is drilled into us. Creatures, non-whites, who are considered less worthy, less trustworthy, less deserving, less human. So South Africa will have acquired that human face only when its people have acquired full humanity. Full humanity where the poor are not tolerated yet exploited because they always will be with us. Or where women are not tolerated yet abused because they are the weaker sex, useful for reproduction, or where LGBTQI persons are not tolerated despite their sexual orientation, yet despised because we, quote, hate the sin but love the sinner. Full humanity, treated, accepted, and honored with indivisible justice, indivisible and inclusive dignity, and unqualified equality. Full humanity. While where we might have been winning the struggle for the right to vote, we will have lost our voice. Full humanity, a life not touched, ruled, and poisoned by fear. In other words, where Matufotso and Impilo are not just simply phrases, or like Ubuntu, a now tattered fig leaf behind which we seek to hide our nakedness, but a free, open-hearted, joyful way of life. Still, full humanity is John Calvin's firm conviction, requires freedom, and that means struggle. For full humanity does not flourish in a situation of oppression, injustice, discrimination, dehumanization, and indignity. This is the result of a freedom defined by the oppressed and the powerless themselves, not the scraps that are thrown to them from the table of the privileged who think that their power justifies their sacralized dominance. The quest for full humanity is inextricable from the struggle for justice, dignity, equity, and freedom. And that is why on numerous occasions, Calvin speaks of tyranny, that is political oppression, economic exploitation, dehumanization through unjust laws and practices, is totally unacceptable. It is rebellion against God. It is a denial of the rights of the powerless, and it is also a denigration of the rights of God. And that is why this brand of Reformed theology insists that not to rise up in resistance against that oppression is cowardice. Rising up against it is a sacred duty. Secondly, Biko is not naive. He knows that this is a struggle and that we are in the struggle for the long haul. The end of formal apartheid would not mean the end of that struggle. That he said already way back in 1970. He spoke of the distant horizon, not in an effort to discourage us, and certainly not in a spirit of defeat in the face of apartheid's formidable might. He knew that power is never surrendered voluntarily. It has to be wrenched from the hands of the oppressor. Long ago, the 19th century abolitionist, literary giant, and black freedom fighter Frederick Douglass made it clear in his own incomparable way. He said this: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men and women who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. It may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And then he ends by saying, the limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. 30 years into our democracy, the realization of Biko's dream still remains the greatest challenge we face. The dream which Biko saw far on the distant horizon is still very distant. For all our challenges, I think the grim, continuous impoverishment of the vast majority of our people, the unconscionable gap between rich and poor, our unconquered racism, our stuttering social cohesion, the tragic failures of our reconciliation process, our battles with crime and corruption, our utterly shameful gender-based violence, bigotry, misogyny, and homophobia, our deplorable lack of leadership, all of this are captured in the longing for our country to have that more human face. The myriad dilemmas and challenges South Africans are facing today, our inability to share life together, to nurture our common humanity, and to build a society worth preserving for our children, I will pose it here today, are all derived from one fundamental dilemma: our desire for shortcuts, subtitles, and substitutes. By 1985, it became clear that the children's revolution started in 1976 was not going to be yet another flash in the pan. It was proving to be a sustained, unrelenting onslaught on apartheid and all its structures and systems, all its suppositions and fundamentals, shaking its foundations to the core. Already, the first state of emergency in 1985 was the sign that the white minority apartheid regime understood this very well. And that is why, at the same time that they were killing our children in the streets by the hundreds, they initiated those secret talks with the African National Congress in exile, making those elite deals for the benefit of the old white apartheid established elites and for the benefit of the new incoming black elites. But those secret deals are not revolution. That is a shortcut. That is also why, as I argue in my 2021 work, Selfless Revolutionaries, Biko, Black Consciousness, Black Theology, and a Global Ethic of Solidarity and Resistance, we have an incomplete revolution. Shortcuts not only need subterfuge, they also need subtitles. Now there is much proud talk, I don't know why, of our national democratic revolution, but it needs subtitles such as the politics of realism, such as negotiated settlement, and the even more deceitful rapid deracialization of wealth and capital. In truth, we know we are sitting with a stolen revolution, supplanted by secret elite deals, balance of power arguments, and sunset clauses, and hence the need for what I call the politics of manufactured contentment, so deftly employed by the establishment since 1994. But revolution needs no subtitles, and it has no substitute. The same is true of our own failed reconciliation process. What we needed and still need after 350 years of the devastations of imperialism, colonialism, and apartheid is reconciliation that is real, that is radical, and that is revolutionary. This is the title of a book I co-wrote with a friend in 2012. We needed a process that would leave no single lie regarding our past and our present unchallenged. But that was too costly for South Africa. because we look for shortcuts. We opted for cheap reconciliation. We rushed to forgiveness, but we skipped the foundational elements of true, sustainable, and durable reconciliation, which actually produce justice, namely remorse, repentance, repair, reparation, and restoration. And without these, there cannot be healing. Because we did not seek reconciliation as distributive justice, the restoration of the land, of history, and of the dignity of our people, reparations for what was stolen from us, the decolonization of our politics, the law, and the courts, we sought refuge in subtitles and substitutes. The Rainbow Nation is not real. It serves as a subtitle for a nation not at peace with itself. Forgiveness is not real if it becomes a subtitle for forgetfulness. If the economy is run and our politics is controlled by a handful of white men, and when the vast majority of the land is still in white hands, serfdom is the substitute for freedom. Just how far have we sunk? When the president hides millions of illegal dollars in his mattresses and in his couches, while the colonialist media tell us to look the other way, the Reserve Bank, SARS, and the NPA have lost their collective tongue, and the few in Parliament who demand accountability are ignored, outvoted, shouted down, and suspended. At the same time, there's a young woman in prison who brought in the same illegal way much less than the president, but she's in prison, and he says where? There is no substitute for self-respect. Meanwhile, the establishment continues to tell us that there is no political alternative. And so we end up with a DA-ANC coalition, especially created for Mr. Ramaphosa's protection and for the promotion of globalist new liberal politics hailed as the only way forward. It is, in fact, a most vicious assault on our dignity as a people, our right to self-respect, obliterating our claims to wholeness and life. But we are expected to remain silent or mindlessly fall in line with the same agenda of suppression, subterfuge, and deception, which comes to us now under the guise of a so-called national dialogue, designed and controlled by the very same forces that brought us 30 years of betrayal and misery. There is no substitute for revolution. My own theology understood and worked with the conviction that to do injustice to any other human being is to break the bonds of our common humanity, since every person, no matter who they might be, is our neighbor, whose face we see as in a mirror, is the way Calvin describes it, and he puts it this way, I quote, "The name neighbor extends indiscriminately to every person, because the whole human race is united by a sacred bond of fellowship. Therefore, to make any person my neighbor, it is enough that they simply be human." This view has far-reaching social, economic, and political consequences, but also, since the cries of the oppressed are the cries from the very heart of God, it is as if God hears God's self-cry in the cries of the oppressed. To do injustice to another is to wound God. So God, in God's pathos for justice, becomes the poor, the oppressed, and the wronged. It is a deeply radical and radicalizing notion. And to understand our participation in the struggles of full humanity is to understand the woundedness of God. That God deems God's self violated in the wounds inflicted upon human beings created in God's image. And so here is my foundational impetus for joining struggles for justice in the world, for upending, disrupting, and destroying systems of injustice, for striving towards the creation of that new humanity. To pursue justice is not only to make life for people better, it is to relieve God's own suffering. Parables, Politics and Prophetic Faith is the title of a little book most recently published, co-authored by my friend and colleague, a circuit judge from Arkansas in the United States, and also a fiery Baptist preacher, Wendell L. Griffin. In that book, we reflect on selected scripture passages as parables for their times of political turmoil, suffering, oppression, and confusion, how those people made sense of it in light of their faith, and how that faith inspired them to go through it all, and then to ask ourselves, have these parables any meaning for us in our situations today? One of my chapters in our book is based on Exodus 8 verse 28, and it refers to words of the Pharaoh during the fourth plague. You can go, Pharaoh says to the Israelites, but then he adds, only do not go too far away. The subtitle of that chapter is On the Perils of Negotiating with the Pharaoh. So for 4 long chapters in the book of Exodus, Moses and Aaron tried to negotiate with Pharaoh, and for all those chapters the Pharaoh proves himself vastly superior. What Moses thinks are winds of change turn out to be merely breezes of deception. You may go, the Pharaoh says at one point, but offer your sacrifices here in the land close by, where I can keep an eye on you, control. Or he says, go, but don't take your little ones, as if it is thinkable that the people would leave their children behind, but it is control. You may go, he says again, but then wonders aloud, but which ones are to go? At another point, he says, you may go, but leave your livestock here, control. And then in an afterthought, as if his magnanimity deserves great praise, you leave your livestock, but even your children may go with you. Power never gives up. Even after 9 plagues, Pharaoh still seeks control. He still thinks it is in his power to define freedom. Negotiations are not only a play on words, they are also a play of power. What the Pharaoh offers in chapter 8, verse 28, comes right in the middle of the devastations of the 4th plague. There are 6 more plagues to come, but it is, in my view, the most significant and the cleverest of all his so-called concessions. It is also the one that makes this aspect of the Exodus story such a powerful parable for our times. You can go, Pharaoh tells the people, only do not go too far away. So, then the Pharaoh says another astonishing thing. After he tells them, do not go too far away. After he has set the parameters and the conditions of their freedom, earning his Nobel Peace Prize by that. He says, you can go, don't go too far, and then he adds one proviso. He says, pray for me. So Moses, caught up in the politics of the palace and forgetting the politics of God, does pray for the Pharaoh. The plague comes to an end, but the Pharaoh then reneges. The people remain enslaved. What Pharaoh is in fact saying is, you will not have your freedom, I will also let you have your religion, provided that your religion should be practiced on my behalf. Pray for me, he says. Just imagine that. While God is punishing the Pharaoh for holding us enslaved, we pray to God to have mercy on the Pharaoh and on his people, so that our enslavement can continue uninterrupted. That is how we got our settlement. That is also how we got our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Seems to me that the white South African apartheid capitalists have proved themselves to be masters at the game, and so they have remained masters of us all. And we brag about this, but foolish pride over imagined victories creates false consciousness. The essence of new colonialism, Nkrumah told his generation, as he is still telling us today, is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, But in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. Nkrumah also saw very clearly and very early that the grip of coloniality on Africa was broad and comprehensive, as we are increasingly discovering today. Their methods, he wrote, are, quote, subtle and varied. Nkrumah elaborates. He says they operate not only on the economic field, but also in the political, religious, ideological, and cultural spheres. The political maneuverings of the imperialist North should be understood in a wider context, he knew. And he dissected this through the lens of the global South in order to truly understand the impact of these actions on Africa and the global South in general. Nkrumah understood what US President Eisenhower was talking about when in his famous last address to the American people, he warned America against the danger of the military-industrial complex. Nkrumah, looking through third world eyes, recognized a globalist agenda. Behind all this, Nkrumah writes, I quote, are the extended tentacles of the Wall Street octopus, and its suction cups and muscular strength are provided by a phenomenon dubbed the invisible government, arising from Wall Street's connections with the Pentagon and various intelligence agencies, what we heard this morning. Looking at and understanding the devastating history of US interventions, coups d'etats and regime change wars across the global South, from the assassination of democratically elected leaders who refused to do the bidding of the US, to the endless wars for endless profits we are witnessing today, killing global South citizens by the millions, one would be utterly foolish or blind or willful not to see the truth of this statement. Nkrumah saw it then, and today we rightly speak of the military, industrial, financial, media, intelligence, congressional complex, broadened. Ramon Grosfoguel broadened it even more, as he speaks of the transformation of the sexual, epistemic, political, linguistic, aesthetic, pedagogical, and racial hierarchies of the modern Western-centric, Christian-centric, capitalist, patriarchal world system. That's a mouthful, but it describes it all. None of it happened without a carefully calculated and coordinated plan executed by the powerful network of organizations, agencies, and institutions Nkrumah pointed us to, and which make the American empire, with the UK and the Western European countries hiding under its skirt, commit such unspeakable crimes against humanity. It also now comes in the guise of all sorts of so-called NGOs working in our midst. The American empire's deadliest proxy, the settler colonial state of Israel, is at this very moment perpetrating genocide and hideous war crimes with abandon and impunity in equal measure in no less than 5 war fronts. With no end in sight, no count of the bodies, with no hope of reprieve, justice, peace, or judgment. This hegemonic grasp for undisputed global power has now reached catastrophic proportions. There is yet another related issue. In those early days of not yet Uhuru, the United States and the UK cooperated to stir such dissent amongst Ghanaians that it led to no less than 6 coup d'etat attempts against Nkrumah and finally his overthrow in 1966, as we also heard this morning. We know that now from a declassified State Department memo to President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Averell Harriman, the writer of that memo, already manufacturing the justification for their future action, wrote, Nkrumah is leading Ghana towards what he calls African socialism, but is in fact a personal dictatorship. However, Averell assures the President that there is hope for, quote, there are still forces at work within the country which may stem that trend. What that means is that we learn from now a similar unclassified document from the UK in 1966 discussing how Nkrumah could be, quote, overthrown and replaced by a more Western-oriented government, end quote. Nkrumah's replacement, according to the plan, would to be a certain General Arthur Ankra. According to the document, quote, a nice, but stupid man, end quote. That's exactly the kind of man the imperialists actually want. Nice means subservient, pliable, unprincipled, and shamelessly opportunistic, disregarding the interest of the people, but focused on the interest of the imperial boss and the crumbs that fall from his table. Stupid means knowing all that, but still being greedy enough not to care. Cultivating, that's the point I want to make here, cultivating and upholding house Negroism is still utterly essential to the globalist agenda. Go, said the pharaohs of the West, only do not go too far. Among the many issues surrounding President Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC under his reign, one of the most disturbing is his captivity to white monopoly capital here in South Africa and in the West, and the ways in which he has led South Africa further along the destructive path of neoliberal capitalism. That South Africa is today the country with the greatest socio-economic inequalities in the world is the result of an economic trajectory chosen by the ANC government since 1994, much to the satisfaction of world bodies like the IMF and the World Bank. Critical analysts, such as Patrick Bond and Saint-Peter Blanche, have seen this from the very beginning and have been ringing the alarm bells ever since. Economist Eugene Cairncross offers scathing but entirely on-point critique of what he calls, quote, the triumph of capital in South Africa's post-apartheid economy. He mentions how tax concessions by the new government, especially to the gold mining industry, have been preserved, and how the privatization and commercialization of state assets like the fuel producer Sasol for a song has benefited Sasol as a private company with a post-apartheid state foregoing all the profits. Under Mr. Ramaphosa, with the South African Airways debacle still hanging over our heads, parts of Transnet and the NEL already gone, with Eskom and the rest of Transnet on the chopping block, what will be left of what is supposed to be the nation's treasure? Eugene Cairncross gives a perfect, if dispiriting description of how far the pharaoh of our negotiated settlement was willing to let South Africa's people go. Not very far at all. He explains how ownership and control of lands, mines, and major industries remain concentrated, quote, in the hands of a handful of capitalists, exactly as it was under apartheid. And not only that, ownership of major economic activities has been, quote, systematically transferred to foreign capital, either directly or through the stock exchange. It seems that nothing was left to chance. Under the ANC government, he explains further, exchange control became another tool of enrichment of the few, albeit that the few now included the new few blacks from the new elite and the political aristocracy. I quote him, during the period of 1998 to 2002, the six largest corporations, Anglo-American, Glencore, BHP Billiton, all mining conglomerates, Old Mutual, South African breweries, and Liberty moved tens of millions of rands offshore, listed as foreign companies. Two major consequences of these actions are initial movement of the vast amounts of capital offshore, out of the control of present or future South African governments. And the future profits made in South Africa would not be kept here, but would be exported to the newly externally listed and domiciled companies. South Africa's current balance of payment deficit, also the nature of our tax base that Helen Zille complains so much about but never mentions this, is to a significant extent attributable to the continued export of profits and dividends to these and other now foreign companies. Now, we don't have time to go into details here, but it would be worthwhile to follow the upward political and economic trajectories of the individuals in the center of power at that time, making these decisions on the country's behalf and for their own benefit. wholly disastrous for our people, but extremely advantageous, strengthening the grip of neoliberal capitalism and the globalist agenda, highly profitable for them personally, as their spectacular wealth and political power testify to today. It is the reward empire offers its minions at the cost of justice for the masses. But this is what the late Jakes Gerwel called South Africa's rapid deracialization of capital. And still, the Pharaoh tightens his grip on the leash. The end result of our last election is the coalition between the ANC and the DA, with a few very small parties like decorations on a Christmas tree, which they still insist on calling a government of national unity, even though nobody believes it anymore. What is now in serious question with what is going on in our government is whether the policies that embody justice and dignity for the vast majority of South Africa's people will survive. While policies that buttress neoliberal capitalism, wreaking such havoc in our country, generational impoverishment, disastrous socio-economic inequalities, chronic and unheard levels of unemployment, further class and racial fragmentation, whether these policies will come to dominate completely. Such conditions as we are living in today, history teaches us, ultimately lead to only two outcomes: either violent revolution and or growing authoritarianism. With the ANC and the DA so close and in bed, both servants to white-controlled capital, I am afraid that they will choose the latter to better repel the first. In 1994, I spoke of a postponed revolution. That might be the possibility staring us in the face right now. We now also know that the GNU is not about unity, certainly not the unity of South Africa's people. It is about white supremacy. It's about what remains in whose hands. It's about our land and our minerals and our oceans and what is under them, from the Reserve Bank and the mines to the minds of our children. If, as the church has argued, white supremacy is an idol, a false god, a perverse parody of the Jesus child, then the African National Congress is a perverse parody of the Magi. But the gifts they are offering are the nobility of our struggle, the sacrifices of our people, and the future of our children. There is no substitute for the politics of decency, honesty, integrity, and courage. Matufatso and Impilo, your invitation suggests, are inextricable from the struggle for the land. I agree. Now, we still do not know enough about all constituted total well-being and life and so forth for the ancient Africans called the Khoi and the San, my ancestors, the people of the cradle of humanity, before the Dutch Christian invaders came here. But from what we are beginning to reconstruct, it was a life deeply and intimately connected with the land, their gods, and with the cosmos, the sky with its sun, the moon and the stars, the symbiotic relationship with the earth and all God's creatures that lived in it, without whom the humans were incomplete, because those relationships were everything. And that is why they call themselves Khoi, sometimes called Khoi, which does not mean men among men, as some people have surmised. It means something different. The closer and better translation is people among other people. It is not the macho braggadocio that is emphasized. It is the interdependent humanness that counts here. In 1799, in what history records as a long oration, Khoi leader Klaas Stuurman addressed British General T.B. von der Leur and his cohort troops and colonizers. Stuurman spoke of the invasion by the Dutch, recalled the calamities of the Khoi under the yoke of the Boers. He says, the injustices in first depriving us of our country and then forcing our offspring into slavery. Stuurman spoke of the cruel treatment at every slight occasion, such that it became unbearable. Hence, the 2 centuries of resistance. Stuurman offered a solution to the British. He said, restore the country of which our fathers were despoiled by the Dutch, and we shall have nothing more to ask. In reflecting upon these words, one is once again struck by the significance of the land and the connection with the earth that the Khoi leader stressed in his address to the white colonizers. It testified to a deep spirituality of struggle, a strain that has never really left us. The return of the land, and his quote, "and we have nothing more to ask," is in my view not a minimalist demand, and perhaps Stuurman knew enough by that time to know that the colonialist Dutch or British or whoever would never give up this beautiful and bountiful land they coveted with all their hardened hearts since setting their eyes on it, certainly not without a fight. It shows rather the absolute primacy of land for the indigenous peoples. Return of the land is, in Stuurman's eyes, the only durable solution. And here is why. It is not about ownership in the sense in which the Europeans brought with them to Africa. It is the knowledge that the land and the people are one, that the land is a mother that feeds, provides, and nurtures, and that one treats one's mother with love and reverence. It is knowing that the history and the stories of the people are the stories of the land. Live with them on the land and shall return to the land. The land nurtures in her bosom those stories about their gods and their beliefs, their faith, their ways of life, and their relationship with the cosmos and with each other. How they follow the sun at its rising and at its setting, and why they converse with the stars, and how they seek guidance from the ancestors. All these are shared with the land as they sit around the fire and share them with their children. The land is the custodian of the innermost being of the people, and the people are the custodians of the land. That is the primal symbolic reciprocity of our sense of belonging. It is with that sensitivity that one lives with the land. One does not own the land, one belongs to the land. And that is why one is obliged to share the land. When the land is returned, the implication is that the invader will be gone, and that the land and the people will be whole again. And Stuurman says as much. When he says we will ask for nothing more, he means because to us the land is everything. If we have the land, our symbiosis with the cosmos is restored. Our children shall have life. We shall have prosperity and a future. Our wholeness will return. The land which has soaked up the blood of our people is the land from which a spirit of resistance shall rise again and again. That's the meaning of land for us. And then Stuurman added this: has not God given plenty of grassroots and berries and grasshoppers for our use? And until the Dutch destroyed them, an abundance of wild animals to hunt. And will they not return and multiply when these destroyers are gone? Listen how Stuurman characterizes the colonizers. They have come to destroy, to kill, and to devastate everything in sight. That is the Matu Fatso and the Upilo lived and longed for, that is now destroyed. The abundant life that would bring healing and wholeness obliterated by supremacist capitalist greed and lust for total hegemony. For that right to life, colonized Africans would fight endless battles with the settler colonialists for almost 200 years. It is a battle that is now being revived. And those who think that this battle will be confined to intellectualized debates within the halls of academia are sadly mistaken. For a few years now, I have been speaking and writing about the politics of vulgarity as a globalist phenomenon. But with articles with this title, The Moral Wisdom of Joe Biden, appearing just a few days ago, I suppose the politics of vulgarity is still with us very much. But political scientist and activist Vijay Prashad is offering us a much more appropriate understanding for which I am grateful. He says, globally and locally, here at home and everywhere, is what is developing what he calls the politics of decadence. Political decadence is the politics of the ruling class caught in the habit of rule. It cannot perceive of itself as not holding power. When that happens, it seeks reasons for its loss of power in everything external, unable to do self-reflection, self-critique, or self-correction. The politics of decadence has no vision of life for itself, for the country, or for the world. It can only deal in destruction and death. It has no compelling narrative that can capture the imagination or the energy of the people. It cannot inspire confidence in itself or amongst the people. It serves no purpose except self-preservation through preservation of the status quo. It has no goals but for itself. And it always reacts violently to those who want to assert their right to inclusion, justice and dignity and equity. Hence, marginalization, aggression, and even destruction of those who dissent and who refuse to bow to their will and their power. I believe Prashad is correctly and precisely describing the situation of the post-democratic West. All the pretense about democracy, the so-called rule of law, is gone. All their inherent fascism is exposed in their response to their own people's solidarity with Palestine. Prashad is also precisely describing our situation in this government of national unity. I call it a monstrosity not just because of the unwieldy, ideologically wholly incompatible and insanely costly cabinet. The deliberately manufactured unsustainability in some portfolios, like land and land reform and agriculture, is but one example. The DA's instinctive defense of colonialism, coloniality, and its innate racism, with the ANC helplessly looking on, make us all complicit in this ongoing criminality. That is the politics of decadence. This GNU is a cesspool of political contradictions held together by an unhealthy sense of entitlement, an unholy disdain for morality, a shameless hunger for power driven by expediency and self-serving interests. Despite our self-glorification about the International Court of Justice, and in defiance of the obligations that have come with those rulings, South Africa's unhealthy ties with the unrepentant genocidal state remain unbroken, because the Zionists are in fact in charge, from Helen Zille to Gayton McKenzie and the President. That mendacity, that hypocrisy and cynicism is the politics of decadence. How much damage will they do to our people before they are done? But perhaps another crucial question about the GNU is now unavoidable, and it is this: are we the first people who, having fought a struggle for liberation and won, are now turning around, begging our oppressors to rescue us from the failures of our own making, the betrayal of our own people, and the misrule of leaders of our own choosing? There truly is no substitute for dignity and self-respect. We are the country we create. In the last 30 years, we have created a country where corruption not only exists, it thrives, is encouraged, and is fiercely protected, from the office of the President on that hill to the small SASSA office in the township, from the Speaker's chair in Parliament to the municipal manager's fake certificates, from the office of the Minister of Justice to the traffic cop on the corner. We have created a blatant new liberal capitalist state where social cohesion, like Noah's dove, cannot find a foothold, because not only have we not eradicated apartheid, we have sat back and watched it metastasize. Knowingly and deliberately and against the Constitution, we brought back apartheid by re-racializing our society and racially re-categorizing our people. We guarantee its death-dealing power through our continued embrace of what Ikili Mbembe rightly called necropolitics, socio-economic inequalities, endless cycles of impoverishment, deepening political despair, death by hunger, as we have seen in the Eastern Cape, death by neglect, as in the slow response to the snacks poisoning spaza shop crisis, death by intent, as in Marikana, and death by shame. We have created a country where we have allowed racism to flourish and be normalized by disguising it with deceitful terms such as meritocracy and fit for purpose, even while giving white people reasons every day to laugh at our claim that we are capable of governing. We have tolerated the worst characteristics of that system, the macro-aggressions of unspeakable miseries of neoliberal capitalism with its concomitant socio-economic inequalities, and the micro-aggressions, such as the racist obsession with our black people's hair at the so-called integrated schools. The Stalinist tendencies in the ANC security laws giving government the right to spy on the religious institutions, civil society organizations, and any persons who raise a voice of dissent. The instinctive imperialism in the DA's so-called power bill for the Western Cape, with its insane demands for what will be essentially white control over large swathes of our lives and our land. And what shall we say about the return of one of the most despicable and vile characteristics of apartheid, namely detention without trial, such as meted out by the highest court in the land to Mr. Zuma just a year or two ago, and so eloquently highlighted by our own Sipho Siepe. But there is a new world, a new Africa in the making. And South Africa, a country with amazing potential, but with a politics without substance, leadership without vision, laws without the remedies of justice, a constitution without constitutionality, is not nearly in a position to navigate these coming changes. We are the country we create. But if that is so, it is also within our power to recreate. So, can we undo the damage? Can we stop the rot of the politics of greed and house negroism and recreate the politics of decency, honesty, integrity, courage, and virtue we once thrived on? Can we discern the realities of imperialism and sub-imperialism at work here? Can we regain the love and the trust of our people? Can we recreate Matufatso and Impilo and refashion meaningful life for our people? Can we reclaim the resilience that made us fight and defeat the mightiest regime on this continent? Amidst this present chaos, can a new South Africa be born? As is evident from the encouraging unfolding events in West Africa's Sahel Alliance and the inspiring leadership of a visionary younger generation, a new Africa is already on the way. The question is, do we have the courage to join her? Now, I would not be here if I did not firmly believe that this is still possible. So let us begin today. Thank you.